Welcome back to Kids Life. It's so good to see you guys. I haven't seen you in a couple weeks, and this is great. We're starting a brand new series today, and it's called Jesus Says. In fact, not just you guys are starting it, but even the adults in the big auditorium are starting it today as well. It's going to be 14 weeks long, and we're going to be talking about something called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we're really lucky because where we live in Concord or Charlotte or wherever you live in Kannapolis, somewhere like that, we live actually pretty close to mountains. And have you ever been hiking? Because if you have, you'll know that hiking is super fun, but it can be super hard. Like if you hike for too long, your muscles will start hurting. You might have to whine and get your mom or dad to piggyback you. Something cool that could happen is you could get really dusty and dirty, and then hopefully you can find a stream to wash off on. Now, the cool thing about mountains is in the day of Jesus, there wasn't a ton of mountains, but Jesus went up on a mountain so that he could give basically a sermon. There are two reasons he did this. The first is that he did not have a really fancy microphone like the one I have right here. See, he couldn't do things like this. You see, that's some of the coolest things that you can do with microphones. He didn't have that, so he had to get up on a mountain so that people hopefully would be able to see him up on the hilltop, and also so he could be heard a little more clearly than if he was in just like a field or a crowded room or whatever. Now, the other thing is that he was hoping that it would remind people of some of the stuff that happened in the Old Testament. There was a guy, you probably have heard of him, Moses, who did the same thing. After Israel came out of Egypt, Moses goes up on a mountaintop and he hears from God, which is pretty awesome, right? And God gives him something we call the Ten Commandments. And it's a whole list of laws. So when Jesus goes up on the hilltop, he's reminding people of that same picture of when Moses went up. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's this phrase that Jesus says actually a whole bunch of times. He says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." And so what Jesus is doing is he's connecting the dots for all the people listening and for us between the Old Testament, and then what he's hoping to do is challenge us to take it even further. Now, we just got done teaching you guys that following Jesus is not about just rules, right? And it may seem like there are a bunch of rules in the Sermon on the Mount, but it's actually not that. Let me explain. What Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to paint a picture, basically of what it looks like to follow him. Do you ever paint or color or draw or anything like that? It's actually very difficult for me to do that. You would not like my drawings, but you know that your goal is that it be really clear what the picture is, and that if you showed it to a friend, they would be able to get it. And so Jesus is trying to do this. He's drawing a picture of what it looks like to follow him and what it looks like if you love and listen to what he says to do. Remember, the disciples, which are the guys who followed him around, were just normal people, just like you and I. But after they followed him for like 2 or 3 years, they started to look different and act different and be different. And that's because they were becoming the picture of what Jesus had laid out for them. The same is true for us. When we look at what Jesus says, we're looking at what it means for you and I to love Jesus and to follow him. So, peace.